and warriors. If your last name is on this list, your ancestor didn't just live on the Isle of Man. They ruled it, they defended it, they built a civilization on a small island in the middle of the Irish Sea that was so strategically positioned. And warriors, so fiercely governed, and so culturally distinct that it was fought over by Vikings, Irish kings, Scottish lords, and English monarchs for 1,000 years. And through all of it, and warriors, the Manx people never stopped being Manx. These 10 surnames survive from one of the smallest, most ancient, and most overlooked Celtic cultures in the world, a culture that produced its own language, and warriors, its own laws, its own parliament, the oldest continuously sitting parliament on earth, and its own warrior tradition that drew from Irish Celtic roots on one shore and Norse Viking power on the other, and warriors, and forged something entirely unique from both. Most of the families who carry these names today have no idea that their surname is a direct linguistic fossil, a word preserved in amber for 1,000 years. And warriors, proof of a Celtic bloodline that survived Norse invasion, English annexation, and the near death of an entire language, stay until number 1. And warriors, because that surname belongs to a dynasty whose ruler held sovereignty over an island kingdom that controlled the entire western sea route between Ireland, Scotland, and England simultaneously. And warriors, and whose descendants still carry that name today. The next surname looks like nothing else in the English surname record. It belongs to no English tradition, no French Norman tradition, and warriors, no Latin church tradition. Pull it back into its Manx Celtic origin, and you find a name that describes exactly the kind of man who survived on a storm-battered island in the middle of the Irish Sea for 1,000 years. And warriors. Number 10, Quail, from the Manx Gaelic Mac Fail, meaning son of Paul, carried through the specifically Manx phonological system that transformed Gaelic sounds into something unique to the island. And warriors, not Irish, not Scottish, Manx. The Quail family appears in Manx records as one of the established landed families of the island, in the structure of Manx society, which combined Celtic tribal traditions with the Norse administrative system. And warriors. The established Manx families held a specific legal status, the yeomanry, free landholders whose tenure on their farms was protected by Manx customary law, regardless of who happened to be claiming lordship over the island at any given moment. And warriors. This legal protection was the most important achievement of the Manx Celtic legal tradition. The laws of man, administered through the Tynwald. And warriors protected the rights of the established Manx farming families against the constant cycle of overlords, Norse jarls, Scottish kings, and warriors. English magnates who claimed sovereignty over the island but could not simply dispossess the people who had been there longest. If your name is Quail, your bloodline is one of the oldest yeoman families of the Isle of Man. And warriors, free landholders who held their ground through 1,000 years of overlords and who used the law rather than the sword to stay exactly where they had always been. And warriors. Number 9 carries a name that connects directly to the Irish Celtic missionary tradition that first brought Christianity, literacy, and the written record to the Isle of Man. And warriors. A name connected to the institution that made civilization possible on an island that the rest of the world kept trying to conquer. Number 9, Crellin, from the Manx Gaelic Mac Crithlin, and warriors, meaning son of Crithlin, a personal name of Irish Celtic origin relating to the trembling of the aspen tree, carried from Ireland to Man by the Celtic Christian missionaries who crossed the Irish Sea in the 5th and 6th centuries. And warriors. The Celtic Christian mission to Man was not a gentle affair. The sea crossing from Ireland to the Isle of Man is 22 miles at its shortest, across some of the most unpredictable water in the British Isles. And warriors, where Atlantic swells meet Irish sea currents, and the weather can change from clear to lethal in under an hour. The Irish monks who made that crossing did so in hide-covered wooden boats. And warriors, carrying manuscripts, relics, and determination. Saint Moghold, one of the patron saints of Man, is said in tradition to have been an Irish pirate converted by Saint Patrick. And warriors, who as penance crossed the Irish Sea in a coracle without oars, landing on Man at the headland that still bears his name. Irish Celtic Christianity arrived on Man early, established deeply, and warriors. and provided the cultural framework that allowed the Manx people to survive Viking conquest with their identity intact. If your name is Crellin, your bloodline carries the Irish Celtic missionary tradition to man. And warriors, the families who kept the records that tell us everything we know about who the Manx people were and where they came from. Number 8 is a name that marks one of the most distinctive cultural features of the Manx Celtic world, and warriors, a tradition that combined the Irish Gaelic system of family identity with the Norse Viking administrative framework in a way that produced something found nowhere else. Number 8, and warriors. Clúchas, from the Manx Gaelic Mac Luces, meaning son of Lucas, from the Latin lux, light, the son of light, a name that arrived on man through the complex layering of Irish Celtic. And warriors, Norse Viking and Latin Christian influences that made Manx culture one of the most intricate cultural hybrids in medieval Europe. The Isle of Man sits at the exact center of the triangle formed by Ireland and warriors, Scotland and England. In the Viking Age, when Norse longships dominated the Irish Sea, this position made Man not a remote island but a hub. The Norse kingdom of the Isles, the Surnames, and warriors, the Southern Isles, with its capital at Man, controlled the sea lanes between every Celtic nation in the Western British Isles simultaneously. The Manx language itself is the proof of this fusion. And warriors, Manx Gaelic is recognizably related to Irish and Scottish Gaelic, but it absorbed hundreds of Norse words, particularly in seafaring, administration, and land use. And warriors, a Clúchas-speaking Manx in the 12th century, was speaking a language partially intelligible to both an Irish monk and a Norse jarl, and fully identical to neither if your name is Clúchas. And warriors, your bloodline emerged from the most remarkable cultural fusion in the medieval Celtic world. The intersection where Ireland and Scandinavia met, argued, intermarried, and eventually produced something entirely new. And warriors. Number 7 is a name that most people would not recognize as Celtic at all, and warriors. But it entered the Manx cultural record at the moment when the Norse and Celtic traditions of the island were fusing so completely that distinguishing between them became impossible. And warriors, and irrelevant. Number 7, call it, from the Old Norse Thorlifa, meaning Thor's legacy or Thor's inheritance. And warriors, carried through the Manx phonological system, Thorlifa becoming Corlet, a transformation that took a name from the Norse warrior tradition and made it Manx so completely that the Norse god of thunder buried inside it became invisible. And warriors. The Norse settlement of Man began in earnest in the 9th century. Viking raiders first appeared in Manx waters around 798. By the mid-9th century, Norse settlers were farming Manx land. And warriors, intermarrying with the Celtic population and establishing the administrative structures, the land divisions called treens, the local courts called moots that would define Manx governance for centuries. And warriors. The critical point is that the Norse who settled Man did not replace the Celtic population. They merged with it. The Manx Celtic language survived because the Norse settlers learned it, and warriors modified it and eventually adopted it as their primary tongue, abandoning their own Norse language within a few generations. The name survived in transformed form. Thorlifa became Corlet. And warriors, the Norse warrior god became a Manx farmer. If your name is Corlet, your bloodline carries a Norse warrior name that the Manx Celtic world took transformed and made its own. And warriors. Thor's inheritance, spoken in Gaelic, farmed in Celtic fields, governed by the oldest parliament on earth. Mid-roll CTA. Before we continue, if you're finding this useful, subscribe to Bloodline Decoded. And warriors. Every week we uncover the history hidden inside the names people carry without knowing what they mean. Hit subscribe and the next video will already be waiting for you. Number 6 carries a name from the heart of the Manx farming tradition. And warriors. A tradition that was not simply agriculture, but a highly organized, legally protected system of land tenure that the Manx Celtic people maintained through every Viking raid, every change of sovereign. And warriors. Every English administrator who arrived convinced he was going to transform the island into something more orderly and more English. Number 6, Cúli, from the Manx Gaelic, and warriors, carried through centuries of phonological transformation into a form that announces its Manx origin to anyone who knows what they are looking at. Cúli, not English, not Irish. And warriors. not Scottish. Manx. The Manx trine system, the ancient land division that organized the island into farms and estates, was one of the most distinctive features of Manx Celtic governance and warriors. Each trine was a unit of land sufficient to support a family, its boundaries established by customary traditions so ancient that no one remembered who had originally drawn them. And warriors. The families who held trines held them by right of customary tenure, a legal protection that survived the Norse conquest, the Scottish lordship, and the English annexation. There is a stubbornness to this history that is entirely Manx. And warriors, not the dramatic stubbornness of battlefield resistance. The quiet, legal, generational stubbornness of people who know their rights, know their land, and know that if they hold to the law long enough. And warriors. The overlords will eventually be replaced by other overlords, and the farmers will still be there. If your name is Cooley, your bloodline held Manx land for 1,000 years through the patient and warriors. Stubborn, legally sophisticated method of simply refusing to leave. Number 5 is a name that connects directly to the warrior tradition of the Manx Celtic world, and warriors. A name that in its Gaelic origin described not a physical characteristic, but a quality of character. The quality that the Manx people most needed during the centuries when their island was simultaneously claimed by Irish kings and warriors, Norse jarls, Scottish lords, and English monarchs. Number 5, Quirk, from the Manx Gaelic Mac Quirk, meaning son of Cork, from an ancient Irish personal name possibly meaning heart or core, and warriors. The son of the heart, the man of the core, the position of man in the Irish Sea made it a prize that every surrounding power wanted, and none could hold permanently. The island changed sovereign hands repeatedly, and warriors. The Norse kingdom of the Isles was contested between Norwegian kings, Scottish kings, and Irish lords from the 12th century onward. In 1266, the Treaty of Perth transferred sovereignty over man from Norway to Scotland, and warriors. In 1290, English forces seized it. In 1313, Robert the Bruce took it back. In 1333, England took it again. Through all of this, the Manx people did what they had always done. They adapted, and warriors. They maintained the Tynwald, they kept their customary law. They negotiated with each new overlord from the position of a people who had been on the island longer than any of them and intended to be there long after they were gone. And warriors. If your name is Quirk, your bloodline held the core of Manx identity through every storm that passed over the island. The families of the heart, who bent without breaking across 1,000 years of competing claims on the land they called home. And warriors. Number 4 goes directly to the intersection of Celtic mythology and Manx cultural identity. A name connected to one of the most powerful figures in the Celtic tradition of the Irish Sea world. And warriors. A name that most people today know in a completely different context, without any idea that its origins reach back to the Celtic kingdoms of early medieval Britain. Number 4. Kermode and warriors, from the Manx Gaelic Mac Diarmada, meaning son of Diarmait, from the Old Irish meaning free from envy or freeman, and warriors. A name of deep Irish Celtic significance that came to man with the Irish Celtic population and maintained itself in the distinctive Manx form that transforms Mac Diarmada into the unmistakably Manx Kermode, and warriors. The name Diarmait carries mythological weight in the Celtic world. Diarmait Uadune, the hero of the Irish legend of Diarmait and Gryne, is one of the great figures of Celtic romantic tradition. And warriors, a warrior of supernatural gifts, marked by a love spot that made him irresistible, who fled across Ireland with the king's intended bride, and was hunted for years by the warrior Fionn Mac Cumhail. And warriors. His story is one of the oldest continuous narrative traditions in Irish literature. In the 21st century, the name Kermode became known worldwide through Mark Kermode. And warriors. The British film critic whose Manx surname announces Celtic ancestry to anyone who recognizes what they are hearing. The ancient Irish hero's name, transformed by Manx phonology, and warriors, preserved through Norse occupation and English annexation, arrived intact in the modern era. If your name is Kermode, your bloodline carries one of the great names of Irish Celtic mythology. And warriors, transformed by man, preserved by time, and still unmistakably what it always was. Number 3 carries the name of a family at the heart of the Manx legal tradition, the tradition that, and warriors. More than any army, more than any act of military resistance, is the reason the Manx people survived as a distinct cultural entity through 1,000 years of overlords. Number 3. And warriors. Cannell, from the Manx Gaelic Mac Cannell meaning son of Connell, from the Old Irish meaning strong wolf or wolf of the same kind. And warriors, a name of Irish Celtic warrior origin that came to man with the early Celtic settlers and survived in a Manx form that preserves the ancient Irish root, the Tynwald, the Parliament of the Isle of Man. And warriors, established in its current form by the Norse rulers of Man in the 10th century, but rooted in the Celtic assembly traditions that preceded Norse arrival, a continuous institution of governance that has met, and warriors, without interruption for over 1,000 years, making it the oldest continuously sitting parliament on earth. The Tynwald's survival is the most remarkable political achievement of the Manx Celtic tradition, and warriors. It survived the transition from Norse to Scottish lordship. It survived English annexation. It survived the period when the island was a feudal possession of the Stanley family. It survived the revestment of 1765 it is sitting today. And warriors. The Cannell families appear in Manx records as participants in this tradition, free Manx families, whose right to participate in the island's governance was protected by the same customary law that protected their land. And warriors. If your name is Cannell, your bloodline built the institution that outlasted every empire, the parliament that the Manx people kept running through 1,000 years of other people trying to run the island instead. And warriors. Number 2 belongs to a name whose origins carry the weight of both the Celtic missionary tradition and the Norse administrative world. And warriors. A name whose story includes the most remarkable act of cultural resurrection in the history of any Celtic language. Number 2. Cubbon, from the Manx Gaelic, with various scholarly interpretations pointing to son of the yellow-haired devotee. And warriors, or son of Cuban, a personal name of Irish Celtic origin, meaning little hound, the small hound, the swift, loyal, fierce creature of the Celtic warrior tradition, Henry Cubbon. And warriors, a 19th century Manx scholar and politician, played a central role in preserving Manx heritage at the moment when the Manx language was declining toward extinction. His work documenting Manx customs. And warriors. Laws and linguistic traditions ensured that when revival movements came, there were records to work from. The Manx language came within a single generation of complete extinction. And warriors. In 1974, Ned Madrell died, and with him the last native speaker of Manx Gaelic, who had learned the language from childhood in an unbroken generational chain reaching back to the Celtic missionaries of the 5th century. And warriors. The language was declared dead, and then it came back. Manx language classes, Manx medium schools, Manx language broadcasts. Today there are children on the Isle of Man growing up speaking Manx Gaelic as a living language. And warriors. If your name is Cubbon, your bloodline belongs to a people who let their language die and then refused to accept that it was gone. And now number 1, this surname, in its various Manx forms, and warriors, belongs to a dynasty that held sovereignty over a kingdom stretching from the Isle of Man across the Hebrides, governing the entire western sea route of the British Isles simultaneously. And warriors, whose rulers were titled Kings of Man and the Isles, whose genetic lineage, confirmed by modern research, connects directly to the Norse Celtic warrior kings who shaped the entire western edge of Britain and Ireland in the Viking Age. And warriors. From the Manx Gaelic Mac, Gofraith, meaning son of Godfrey, from the Old Norse Gudröðr, meaning God's peace or divine counsel, a name that began in the Norse world. And warriors. Came to man with the Viking kings who made the island their capital, was adopted into the Gaelic linguistic framework, and survived in Manx form through 7 centuries of subsequent history. And warriors. The Kingdom of Man and the Isles was established in its most powerful form in the 11th and 12th centuries. King Godred Crovan, whose name is the origin of the Gorry surname. And warriors. Conquered man in 1079, established a dynasty that would rule the island for 2 centuries, and created the political framework within which the Tynwald developed into the institution it remains today. And warriors. Godred Crovan is called in Manx tradition Gorry Muar Great Gorry, and the laws he established for the governance of man were the foundation on which Manx customary law was built. And warriors. He was a Norse warrior who became a Manx king, who governed a Celtic island, who codified law in a tradition that blended Norse administrative sophistication with Celtic legal custom. Genetic studies of populations in the Isle of Man, the Hebrides, and warriors, and the coastal areas of Ireland and Scotland that fell within the former Kingdom of Man and the Isles have identified Y chromosome lineages consistent with Norse-Celtic admixture at precisely the period when the Crovan dynasty was at its height. And warriors. The genetic signature of the Viking Age Irish Sea Kingdom survives in living men whose surnames Gorry, MacCorry, Mac Godfrey announce their connection to the man who built it, not mythology. And warriors. Law. Inscribed in the Tynwald records, confirmed by genetics, proclaimed every midsummer on Tynwald Hill in 2 languages, one ancient beyond memory and one spoken again after everyone said it was gone. And warriors. 10 surnames, 10 families, 10 corridors leading back through the mists of the Irish Sea, through the monastic cells where Celtic monks preserve the records that tell us who the Manx people were. And warriors. Through the Viking longships that brought Norse warriors who became Manx farmers within a generation, through the Tynwald Hill where free Manx families stood for 1,000 years to hear their laws proclaimed. And warriors. And through the last native speaker of a language that died and came back to life. Your name is not just Manx. It is a kingdom in the middle of the sea. It is a parliament older than any other. And warriors. It is a language that refused to die. It is the proof, written in surnames and genetics and unbroken parliamentary tradition, that a small Celtic people on a small island held everything that mattered across 1,000 years of storms. And warriors. Drop your surname in the comments. Tell me if your family left Man for the ports of Liverpool, for the mining towns of Wales, for the American Midwest, for wherever Manx emigrants carried their names and their history. And warriors. Tell me if you knew your name was Manx before today, because those stories are the continuation of everything on this list. If you made it to the end of this video, subscribe to Origins Decoded. And warriors. Every week, another name, another bloodline, another history that nobody told you was yours.